Thanks, August. Appreciate that. It's really nice to be back even virtually with all of you guys and to see you again and get harassed again. But it's like a homecoming for me at this point. I really enjoy this group and wish there were more groups like this around. It's really remarkable. As August said, I'm going to talk to you guys about wolves and ravens and people. I'm going to start sharing my screen to get that going. And really, this is a very much a work in progress. Um, I had sabbatical last year, which any of you academics out there know is the best perk by far of our profession. And I was able to spend most of my time in Yellowstone doing this work. And I've been interested in Yellowstone for years. I've taken a class the last 23 years over spring break, and this was a time where I could spend more time there and really get to know the animals a bit better. And as I share with you, we were fortunate enough to also be able to tag quite a few ravens and let them teach us what they know about the area and how they use wolves and really more how they use people. Get that out of the way. So here's an example of ravens using a wolf kill. This was a small elk that had been killed. And within the day, you see a golden eagle, or sorry, bald eagle sitting right on top of it, and a series of ravens around it. You might notice that some here in the middle are tagged. Some of our birds joined in on this, and we'll follow the movements of some of these birds as we go through the program today and see how they're keyed in on this type of resource, and also other ones in the area that are a little more familiar to all of us: water treatment plants and garbage dumps. And these are incredibly important resources for ravens in the Yellowstone ecosystem all throughout the West. And really, the punchline of this story is that ravens seem to like us a lot more than they like wolves at this point. Maybe they're a bit hooked on us. And that leads to some issues that we'll come back to at the end in terms of conservation and how to manage that situation. My interest in ravens, it was spurred in Flagstaff, as August was saying. As a grad student, I was watching a jay nest that I was studying, and a raven came in and ate the babies right in front of me, which was a bummer because I was collecting data on parental attendance and behavior at the nest. Well, without young in the nest, there wasn't much behavior at that nest. So I developed a bit of a love-hate relationship with these birds, but my wife and I went and spent 3 years with Bern Heinrich in Maine as a postdoc to study the winter behavior of ravens in a little more detail. And Bern's a great guy. I'm sure many of you have read his books. He's prolific writer, but also just an incredibly curious and incredible naturalist. Best person I've ever been with in the field by far. Not the easiest guy to get along with all the time, but certainly, man, if there's anything out there, he knows what it is and knows an awful lot about the natural history of it. Well, he was intrigued by ravens one time as he was in Maine. He noticed that usually you'd only see a couple of ravens. And once a food source was discovered, like a deer or a dead cow, a large number ravens would gather there. And he couldn't figure out why, one, how this occurred. What was a mechanism that allowed a lot of ravens to learn of this location? And if there was some sort of sharing or advertising going on here, why in the heck would any raven give up the location of such a valuable resource there? They could survive all winter on a dead cow. And yet they seem to end up sharing that with 50 or 100 of their unrelated compatriots. So this graph just shows the basic buildup of ravens after a discovery of a carcass at day 0 here that we would put in the field. Usually in the first day or a few days, if it's a small animal like a deer, the number of ravens at that kill or that carcass we put out would quickly jump from just a few up to 25 to 50 birds. Even longer, it would take for birds to build up at a cow, but the numbers would eventually reach a higher number. And then as that food is eaten, the number would decline. So just kind of remember the shape of this rapid buildup, usually over the course of a couple of days or many days for a big carcass, and then a gradual decline. Because I'll show you some data from Yellowstone that are plotted in the same way, but they look quite different. Well, let me give you a little background on ravens. I know many of you know this, but just as a bit of a background, there are two main groups of ravens out there. There are pairs, such as this male and female, that are preening one another. This is a male preening his mate, a female. With most corvids, as is the case, the ravens mate for life. Males are a little bit bigger than females, and they defend an all-purpose territory. They spend a lot of time grooming one another, patrolling that territory, and defending it from other ravens in the area. There's another aspect of raven life, though, and that's the one that really intrigued Byrne, and that is this accumulation of a large number of ravens at a food source. This is a raccoon we put out as a part of our experiments back in Maine. But the point here is that these birds are not territorial. There might be a few territorial birds there, but for the most part, these are what we call vagrant non-breeders or wandering birds. And they seem to be important to group up, whereas the pairs don't seem to attract others when they find a kill. So the basics of this story that we uncovered in Maine kind of go like this. That pair of ravens is often the first at a very rich food source, like a dead moose here. It might be killed over winter. Remember, when we were doing this study, this was back in the early late 80s and 90s, and there were no wolves in Maine at that point, and not a whole lot of coyotes. So not a lot of big predators out there providing food. But when a pair of ravens would find a winter kill or some other source of food like this, they would be quiet. They would keep it to themselves as long as they could. But eventually, some of these vagrants, like shown here with our tag bird, would fly over, try to feed. As they tried to feed, the adults would defend vigorously. They would attack them. These young birds would beg. They would give cries that we called yells, which are used to appease the attacking of the adults, trying to turn off that aggression. But all that noise might attract 3 or 4 or 5 ravens around, young ones or non-breeders, and they would try to access the food, and occasionally they would, but really they didn't have good access to the food until they were back at a communal roost, which in Maine would harbor maybe 50 to 100 ravens, all vagrants, and those birds would somehow get the message to come join those few discoverers that weren't able to eat at the moose the next day. So this is why you'd start with maybe 2 to 5 individuals for the first couple of days at a carcass, and then you'd get a big jump of 25 to 50 individuals coming in. These are birds that would follow those who knew of where the food was from the roost. And to us, it looked pretty passive. The birds who knew where the food was would simply go to it first thing in the morning. And if you didn't know where food was, your best strategy at the roost was just to wait and follow those who flew out with some purpose. And typically you would be led to a food source like this. So that's kind of the mechanism that we had in mind when we started this work in Maine, started this work in Yellowstone. And we were curious to see how this might be affected by the presence of wolves. Of course, the interaction of wolves and ravens has been talked about and painted here and thought about for a long time. These two animals were close companions of people as they came into North America and colonized. They've influenced our beliefs and legends and religions and language tremendously, the two of them especially. But there's a lot in the literature, there's a lot in the popular press about how these two animals interact, how tight this relationship is. And here's just a few statements. The first 3 there are from Barry Lopez's book about wolves. And the last one from Byrne's work with a couple of, a student, Dan Staler, and a biologist, Doug Smith, in Yellowstone. So, how the thing that really struck me was that it really seemed that these observers were suggesting that ravens were following wolves, maybe even leading wolves to food, which I never really thought made much sense because I don't see wolves as needing a lot of help in finding their food. And really, ravens certainly are going to parasitize any free meal that's out there. But how much were they really just going to stick with a pack of wolves and follow them around? That we weren't sure about. But Bernd and Dan had observed this on several occasions, that maybe even these ravens were pointing out to wolves an injured elk, or maybe they were just trying to get the elk themselves. We don't know. A few other observations from David Meach, a wolf biologist, the dean of wolf biologists on Isle Royale in Minnesota, where he really drew a tight connection again, where it seemed like that without wolves, the ravens would have no food. So that was kind of the background. Some of the more detailed studies that were done to really quantify this background are shown here. And I'll give you a few examples of some of these data, and then I'll get into what we did, where we came in at this, but just trying to set the background of what we knew at this point. So again, Dan Staler's work was that he would watch wolves and other organisms like coyotes here in the landscape and see how many times ravens were associated with them. And for wolves, ravens were associated with any wolf he saw 87% of the time. They were always there when they were mousing. They were always there at a kill. There was never a wolf kill that didn't have a raven with it. And they did travel with them, and they sat around with the resting wolves as well. They were in on some hunts. They were present 87 or so percent of the time when wolves were chasing prey. So it seems there's a tight relationship there, unlike there is with coyotes, where ravens are rarely in the company of coyotes, and certainly rarely with elk or in the landscape in general. There are a lot of ravens there, but they really seem to be focused in on wolves. And Dan put out different carcasses. He'd put out carcasses like we did in Maine, the experimental ones here, and he'd also watch at wolf carcasses, wolf-killed carcasses. And this graph just shows that if you put out a deer or an elk in Yellowstone, it's going to take at least a half an hour before a raven even sees it, as opposed to basically instantaneously when a carcass is killed or an animal is killed by a wolf. And likewise here, the number of ravens at these kills increases greatly throughout the first hour after a wolf kill. And this suggests, again, something very different than what we saw in Maine. This is all local enhancement, the birds seeing the kill or seeing the activity at the kill and coming in within an hour, not going to a roost at night and coming back and slowly building up at this. So from this, we know that indeed ravens will follow wolves and that they will immediately take advantage of a kill. We started counting ravens in wolf habitat and human use areas in the Yellowstone region with my class in 2009. And this just shows some of the raw data, basically, as we were driving along the BBS route, the breeding bird survey route in the park. We were doing point counts at different places in Gardner and in places where there was hunting of bison by native tribes. And these were all done in March. And my point here is simply there's a lot of variability from year to year, from just over 100 or so ravens to sometimes we would count over 300 ravens. And we were interested in what drove this variation and how it might have differed in the park, in the wolf habitat versus in human use areas. And what we saw is just revealed in these graphs. So if we look at ravens in response to snow cover, snowier snowier springs basically were associated with fewer ravens deep in the park and more ravens around places like the dump in Gardner. And likewise, in years when there was a lot of biomass killed by the wolves in the park, there were more ravens in the park and there were fewer ravens at the dumps and things outside of the park. So it suggested there was a give and take here where ravens might be moving in and out of the park depending on snow or depending upon what the wolves were actually accomplishing. So we put a proposal together to try to learn more about this. What was the relative use that ravens were making of wolf versus human provided foods? How did it relate to abiotic conditions? And what were the mechanisms that ravens used to exploit wolves? Was it done through transfer of information at the roost or through just seeing it in a given day. And we were supported by Max Planck Institute, National Geographic, and the University of Washington to investigate these ideas. So first off, let me tell you how we catch our birds. And I'll show you with a short video here of from Bob Landis. Oops, let me get it. Yeah. So here's a couple of 3 ravens feeding at a piece of a bison that was pulled out of blacktail ponds by a group of wolves. And our gun is right there. We can shoot it remotely and shoot a net over, and in this case, lucky enough to catch 2 at least of those birds. As soon as we caught them, with the help of Matthias Loretto, who I'll show you a better picture of in a second, we attached these radio transmitters to the bird's back as a backpack. And this is a standard kind of approach we've done with ravens in Washington and lots of different places. But these radios are pretty cool. They were able to be charged by solar energy, so a little solar panel on the top of these transmitters. They had a series of antennas that would download information and upload information from the cell network, as well as allow us to interrogate the tag directly and obtain very precise GPS-derived locations of the birds on a schedule that we set. We were able to get the velocity the bird was moving in 3 dimensions and lots of other stuff, which we have just barely started to dig into to try to understand. I'm going to focus on the locational data for you now. Here's a picture of Matthias. He's a postdoc at the Max Planck Institute in Germany, where he's working with leaders in the field of migration ecology and movement ecology of all kinds of animals. And Matthias secured a really nice postdoctoral grant and position from the EU that allowed us to purchase 60 of those transmitters I just showed you. And our goal was then to catch ravens and put those tags on and then sit back and let the data roll in and see what we could learn. And we were lucky to be able to catch all 60 of the birds we went after. Well, I wouldn't say all that we went after. We missed more than the 60 we caught. But we did get tags on 60 birds, and we've been following them now for just a little bit over a year. And those are the data I want to dig into with you and just show you a little bit about what we're learning. And I'll probably raise more questions than I answer with this, but you'll get an idea of the kind of work we're doing and the kind of information we're able to get. So here's some of our ravens foraging on a dead bison that was killed by a wolf pack in the Tower Junction area, for those of you who know the park. And almost all of this work is in the northern range of the park. So how well do they use these carcasses, and how well do they exploit wolves? Here's the graph that I said would be in the same vein as the kind of graphs we made when we were working with Bernd in Maine. And what we see here is the number of ravens, and the numbers are in the little circles here, over the first day, second day, third and fourth day of a wolf kill of a bull elk in the Lamar Valley. And basically the wolves were there for the first 3 days, and then they were done with whatever they could get off of the carcass, and they left. And the number of ravens, as you'd expect, it does increase and it decreases as the food dwindles. But what's striking to me is the up and down here a lot. And especially the fact that a lot of our changes during the day were much greater here, going from 1 to 15 ravens than they were overnight. So the next morning, the number of ravens did increase up to 23. So that suggests maybe something from a roost going on there. But from that point on, there were always more birds that came in during the day than came in from one day to the next. And that was very different than what we saw in Maine. Here's another, the more typical pattern at an elk again in the Soda Butte area. I was able to watch this one raven and these 4 actually with the wolves before the kill was made. And then the kill was made, and the number of ravens skyrocketed during the first few hours up to 33 individuals. And we really hardly ever saw any more than that for the rest of the time. Their numbers varied throughout the first day, increased by just a couple the next day, and then declined from there on out. So it really seemed like that all the action was happening within the day, not from one day to the next, which really suggested to us that roosts were probably not all that important. And these numbers that are up here is not a big deal, but it just shows that on average overnight, we lost birds and we gained them during the day. So let's look at one of these kills, that one I just showed you in particular, in detail with the radio tag birds that we had out there at this time. So what we see here is that this is the area where the wolf kill was made. And this is just prior to that kill being made. We had 2 territorial birds in the area, in the Lamar Valley here. The purple and red are 2 different individuals, and those dots are their locations that we get about every half hour. Some birds more, some birds less frequently, depending on the way we've set their tags. But at the same time, there were 2 other birds in the general area. A tag bird up here, up by Billings, and another one over here by Bozeman, 100 or so miles away, that would eventually come in and use this kill. So just to keep an eye on those 4 birds as we go through this process. So first off, on day 1, in the morning, 7:30 and 11 a.m., these 2 territorial birds ended up at the wolf kill, and they were part of the scene there of those 30 birds or so that were foraging on this in day 1. No other birds, no of our other tag birds were in there. And again, we had like 60 individuals in the general area that could have potentially come in here. But the 2 close territorial birds did. And that's kind of what we'd expect from situation in Maine. They're the first on the scene. They're right there. And they were presumably able to hear the wolves probably howling that night or in that morning when the kill was made just before light. And they would have come in. Now on the second day, this bird from Bozeman, for some reason, all of a sudden makes a circuit of 140 miles in that day, goes all the way down almost to Cody, Wyoming here, circles back around and comes into the wolf kill. How it would have possibly known about that kill at that time is beyond me. There was in fact another bird in this roost who went a different direction. Did not lead this bird, or this bird didn't lead that bird to this kill. And it really looks like this bird was just making a random circuit and hit upon a rich food source here. Heard the group of, again, 33 or so birds that were there. On day 4, this bird that we had seen up by Billings all of a sudden makes a beeline straight into the kill, 100 miles away. Comes in and exploits that kill. So we have 4 of our tag birds at this kill over the course of those 4 days. The 2 territorial birds and these 2 non-breeders that come in with, again, how they knew about that information. We've spent a lot of whiskey trying to figure out, and we just don't know. I can tell you how they didn't do it, I think, but not really how they did. So for example, there was a communal roost right up here, 2.5 miles away from that kill. And there were 3 non-breeders at that roost during the time this kill was made, and those adult territorial birds foraged on it. And of those 3 birds that were there, only one, the green line here, was that one of our non-breeders that came from Bozeman and roosted up there one of the nights and then came down and went to the kill. The other birds that were in this communal roost went different directions. They went back towards the town of Gardner rather than coming down to this kill. So clearly they would have known about it here, and yet they chose not to go there. It makes a little bit of a sense when you think about the social dynamics of ravens, especially when they're in a competitive situation like at this case, a bull elk that was killed there. The wolves ate that bull elk, ate a lot of that bull elk. There was not a lot of food left, and the most dominant ravens are going to get the most food, and those are going to be the territorial birds nearby. So it makes sense for them to have gotten right in, and they didn't advertise this location. They were just fighting and keeping everybody they could off and trying to eat as much as they could, and that information was parasitized by these other birds in the area. So young birds from this roost coming in, and perhaps these birds that decided to go elsewhere, they were perhaps very subordinate, or they didn't, they knew of a better feeding source elsewhere. There's a lot of food available, and if you're not of high enough status to get into a limited feeding opportunity, your options are probably better to go elsewhere. And I think that's what was going on here. But again, how this bird who ended up roosting here and then exploiting it the next couple of days, how it initially found out about it, I really don't know. So, oh, one thing I should say, let me just step back here a second. Both of these territorial birds roosted over here on their own. They never joined this communal roost. They roosted as territorial birds typically do, alone in their territory, and they exploited that kill. So they were not using communal information, certainly, to find it, which we didn't expect them to. But just to prove the point again that it seems a very different situation than we were seeing in Maine. Well, one of the things we've tried to understand is how different individuals, and again, maybe it's related to their social status or to their breeding status, how those different strategies come to play out in this ecosystem. So I want to go through a few of those different strategies with you. Here's just a collection of our birds. You can see here that this is a mated pair again. They're both in what we call the ears up, this feathering that sticks up, and pants down, these feathers along the tarsi that make them look big and macho. Here's another bird coming in to challenge these guys. He's also coming in a very dominant posture with his pants down here, whereas some of these birds with fuzzy heads are subordinates and they're staying away from the fray here. So there's a lot of this social activity that occurs at a carcass, and that would determine whether it's worth it for you to join or to go elsewhere for food. Well, let's first talk about breeders. Breeders have some constraints on them when they're tending young in the spring or raising, laying eggs and incubating. They've got to care for these kids that are as big as they are. They take all the food they can get in a day, and they don't travel very far because of that. So one of those territorial birds is shown here, just again, a accumulation of points by this bird from May to August of this past year. And its nest is here where the yellow pin is. And this bird just spent all of its time within a few miles. I think 5 miles was the farthest we had him go at this point when he's tending for his mate who's incubating, providing food for her, and also then for their young. And here's just his nest, raven nest. If you haven't seen, it's tucked in very deep into the foliage here, well hidden and concealed. And this was a successful nest that produced these 3 fledglings. And these fledglings stayed around with the parents for a month or 6 weeks. They go to the foraging places where the parents are. They learn about food resources at that time by staying with their parents. And their parents tolerate them for that first month or 2, and then they're evicted from their territory and they're on their own. Well, here's the pink dots where this bird was spending its time during the breeding season. And then as we look at September and April, all these blue lines and the blue dots you'll see are where this bird then went. He expanded his range tenfold. So the distance that he had spent around his nest here, it was at the most 5 miles. Now he was going daily 57 miles north and west to the town of Gardner in that area to search for food. And what was he doing there? Why the heck would he go 57 miles one way every day during the autumn? Well, he's going up and he's exploiting 2 things. Hunters. This is the hunting area. It's a prime elk hunting area in October and November. And all these little clusters of points are where this bird spent time, often with many other ravens, exploiting gut piles from hunters. And over here is a bison hunting area that the native tribes also hunt quite heavily and leave bison carcasses that these birds also exploit. And there's also a carcass dump up here that the Park Service puts injured or animals that have been killed in the park accidentally up there. And the birds all know this area. So like a switch, when hunting season started on the 15th, The 2 days later, this bird was up there foraging among these ridges. And when it didn't have enough gut piles to get, it was getting human resources at dumps. This is the Gardner wastewater treatment plant that I showed you that picture of initially, and the garbage dump there. And then this area by Corwin Springs is another one of these dump areas. Just a few green boxes, big dumpsters that are out there for the rural residents to come and leave their garbage in before they're hauled off. And these are exploited heavily by the birds. Well, if you're a breeder, you not only produce life and live an interesting life, you also die. And in Yellowstone, we've had a few of our birds killed. This one in particular was one of the first birds we tagged, Cheddar, because we caught him on cheddar cheese at a picnic area. He was pretty famous bird in this area. A lot of people got to see him and interact with him. He was quite a showboat. But he was killed by a great horned owl one night. And these are his remains, these feathers. A couple of skiers had come by and told me they had seen something I might be interested in. And I hadn't seen Cheddar for a week or so at that point, and figured he was probably dead, but wasn't sure. And they showed me this picture, and I was like, oh, I know what that is. And they described kind of generally where it was, and they didn't know, particularly, but I snowshoed up after their trail. And right when I got to a spot and saw those feathers, my GPS went off indicating I was at this long-term roost of Cheddar and his mate that they spent every night in for about 3 months. And being a little too consistent and nearby home led probably to an easy kill by this owl to find them. So what about non-breeders? Those are some of the breeding birds, and we'll come back to some more of those. But there's two of our non-breeders. These are second-year birds that we tagged, again, right in Yellowstone. And both of these birds traveled over 500 miles one way up to Canada. This bird died up there, but this bird is still moving around throughout the Rocky Mountain front in Calgary. And they were exploiting lots of agricultural resources, it looked like. Perhaps wolves up here especially, but certainly exploiting human resources almost entirely. So large movements. We saw that 100 miles that a bird would come in to hit a wolf kill. Here they're traveling 400 or 500 miles. Really, it's no big deal for these birds. So one of the birds we captured was called Bernie, and we don't typically name our birds. These two birds, Bernie and Ernie, were their names. They were named by a construction crew that was doing road construction, and they were famous for when cars were stopped because of the construction. These birds would walk right down the middle of the highway and in the park and beg from cars, and people would throw them food. And of course, the construction guys fed them, and so they hung around. And we were lucky enough to catch one of them, turned out to be the male. And we tagged him and followed him around. So he provides an interesting example of what we thought was a breeder for sure. It was a pair, but didn't seem to end up breeding, or at least wasn't successful. We did not find his nest, so I'm not positive. But here's what his movements were the first few days after we caught him, just in the same spot basically here. And he was exploiting the construction site. But the construction ended right after we captured the bird. They had just finished their work and moved on. And so what we saw was with Bernie's, he started like the other territorial bird I showed you, and he headed up north. So going from this part of the park up to the Gardner area where the hunting grounds around Jardine, Montana are. And the green just shows his tracks back and forth working those hunters. During his first winter, the yellow shows his area that he traveled. So he expanded a bit. He went to West Yellowstone and traveled around a bit more, exploiting resources, but mainly stayed in this same kind of pattern that we saw that last bird as well, commuting to the north and west. And right before the coronavirus hit, those 3 weeks in March, he again concentrated his activity right in here. And then, unfortunately, when the coronavirus really took off, the park was closed, and it was even closed to researchers such as myself. And so my wife and I, who were there working on the birds, left the park. But fortunately, the tag still provided data for us to see what Bernie would do when people were forced to leave the park. And we were out of there until June. And the pink here shows his movements after the park was closed. So this bird is wandering in places here where it had never been. It's crisscrossing a much larger area. It's going up to human areas outside of the park as well. Now, not all of our birds expanded their range in response to the closure, but some that were more interior, like this guy, did. And just for your orientation, sorry, I should have said this earlier, this is Yellowstone Lake, and this is the border of the park here, this white line. Then during the breeding season, he really started moving. The blue tracks here show where we got all of his observations during the breeding season. And this is why we could never find a nest for him. He was covering hundreds of miles. These are the Tetons down here. Here's the Tetons. He's going well south of the Grand Tetons, all through the center part of Yellowstone, still concentrating a lot up here, but we were unable to locate a nest in that area. So maybe he failed early because of the park closure, which is something we suspected with a few of our birds. It's interesting, this next hunting season, so this past autumn, he again, although he was covering a much larger area, the purple lines here, he still went back and spent a lot of time right where he was the prior autumn. The green dots here are his 2019 points during the hunting season, and the purple are the 2020 locations. So I wanted to show this to you just for the fact that, to point out, these birds have an incredible spatial memory of a huge area. He's covering hundreds of miles here, and he's going back at the right time to the right place to get hunting offal, gut piles, and then wandering out and maybe broadening his map even, and expanding his known territory during times when he's not getting food here. He's exploiting other either hunters or other resources here. He goes over almost to Cody again here. And it seems like he's kind of moving that way. So here's all of his points now together, not just the lines. And the blue ones are the ones for just this last month or so. And he seems to be moving south and maybe concentrating here down around the Tetons. And I mean, I always need a good excuse to go down to the Tetons. So I guess we'll have to go down there and see what he's really up to. But he's given up a lot on this area where we initially caught him and where he was associated with that kind of ephemeral resource of a construction site. But still knows where the hunters are and knows how to get around a large area. So whether he's a breeder or not, we don't know, but I think he holds the record now for living in the largest area of any known raven. The perimeter around that space he occupied for the first year was 525 miles, and it included 6,500 square miles of territory. That's a big chunk of the West, the Yellowstone ecosystem, to really command. And I think he commands those areas pretty well, knows what's hot, when, and where to go. Well, he wasn't the only one to beg from cars. If any of you have been, well, I mean, almost anywhere you go in the West, if there are ravens around, you'll see this sort of behavior. Maybe not to the extreme that you see in Yellowstone. This is a adult breeding bird that's just eyeing this guy in the car. He eventually gets a chunk of sausage from him. But these ravens know how to work people. They walk right up to you. They look sadly at you. They twist their heads and they just wait, just like he's doing. He's just on point, waiting, making eye contact with this human to get him to throw him a cracker, which of course he eventually does. Well, I want to tell you a little bit about a bird that's called Stevie. Again, we didn't name it. I caught Stevie. He was the easiest bird. She was the easiest bird because her name really is Stevie, although the locals called her Steve. I caught her, we'd had a bad run. I mean, if any of you, if you hunt or trap or anything like that, you know there are a lot of days where you get nothing. And we'd had a pretty bad run trying to catch our ravens, and we wanted to get our tags on. And Matthias and I split up on this day. He went one way and I decided to go up to Cook City, which is at the northeastern entrance to the park, just outside of the park. And I thought, well, I'll see if there's any, hungry local ravens that maybe we can catch one and get a tag on. And I saw one raven and I tossed a big chunk of suet out, and within seconds, that bird just was a beeline, bam, right down to it. And I thought, oh, finally an easy bird. So we set up and I caught it and we tagged it and let it go. And it had been about a month before there was a kind of a party at the Buffalo Ranch where I was staying for the winter. And there was a school teacher from Cook City there. There's one small one room school in Cook City. And she happened to ask me about a raven. And did I know anything about a tagged raven? I said, well, yeah, we probably tagged it up there. And she goes, well, the people are really upset because this had been their town mascot for the prior year or two. And it had kind of a hurt foot, which I didn't notice when I caught it. I mean, it came in like a rocket and seemed fine to me. But Steve had quite a following in Cook City. And this woman, in fact, is a barmaid in Cook City, and she had trained Steve to ring this bell to get food from her. I'll show you a little video clip where she tried to get him to do this for me while I was there. But Steve's hungry. Nice territorial calls, although it, as you'll see, is a non-breeder, pecking around at food that she put out she's really not too interested in. The woman inside there is trying to get him excited about getting a chunk of roast beef. Uh-oh. He really doesn't want that piece of bread. Oh. Sees the meat, taps the bell, she comes out and feeds him. She had done this before he was tagged. And so when they first saw this bird show up with a backpack and all kinds of leg ornaments on it, they were furious. They wanted to catch it and take this stuff off. And they're like, who in the heck, caught our bird and did this to it? And what's going on? And well, I went up and talked to them, and then they were really excited, and they were glad to learn more about it because they didn't know where Stevie went, especially in the summer. And so as we started to get data, this is first I had to tell him it's not Steve, it's Stevie. She's a female. And the guy was okay with that. And the woman was, of course, great, awesome. I knew she was a female. And so we started tracking it, Stevie's locations. And the dark cloud here is right around Cook City. But she wandered all the way down to Cody, Wyoming, on up by Gardner and around in an occasional loop. But most of her time was just spent there. The cluster of points right around the town is really dense. And as we looked at those, here's Cook City. She again spending most of her time there, but there was another cluster up here by Kersey Lake. And this is about 3 miles in, right at the edge of the Beartooth Wilderness. I was like, what in the heck is she doing up there? What could possibly be there? And so I didn't think too much about it. And finally I thought, well, I better really take a closer look at the imagery there. And as I drilled down, here's what was underneath that cloud of points, a cabin way up there. And about that same time, I got an email from a lawyer, which of course is what you never want to get, but got an email from a lawyer, and he said, hey, my friend, he lives in this cabin up by Kersey Lake, and he has this tagged raven that hangs out with him. Do you know anything about it? Well, yeah, might know something about that. And so we talked and talked, and finally the guy said, you should go up there and meet Lowell and talk to him about it. So we brought our dogs and hiked up. Here's the cabin. We're hiking up into it. And I figured this guy is some kind of hermit, right? This has got to be just a strange situation, but we need to check it out. So we did. And here's Lowell. Lowell turns out he was the lieutenant governor of South Dakota, and quite an outdoorsman, quite an interesting dude. We had a great day up there with him. Here's Steve with a chip that she's gotten from Lowell. And boy, Lowell will do anything for this bird. He just thought it was the neatest thing and made his whole summer up there. He's back in South Dakota now, and wishing he was with corvids instead of COVID, no doubt. And really can't wait to get back up and see this bird. So this individual non-breeding raven really made incredible connections with people, allowed us to meet some interesting people, and just showed again the ability of a bird like this to work people and to make, you know, a life out of begging and scrounging from individuals. Some of them don't beg, they just steal. So this is not a bird in Yellowstone. This is in the Grand Canyon. But just to demonstrate the kind of thievery that these birds can do, a friend who works in the park there sent me this video. And this raven's rifling through a pack. Obviously didn't need any glasses, maybe looking for a diamond ring or pills, who knows. But eventually ended up getting a sandwich out of this pack. And these birds were famous for doing this same sort of behavior, opening up the back ends of snowmobiles in Yellowstone. And so I was curious if we could see that, and went to Old Faithful in the winter to try to observe that behavior, because that's where was kind of the epicenter of it. So get into Old Faithful, and we do have a couple of birds tagged there. Here, just an aerial view of Old Faithful to show you where the birds are hanging out. Here's two of our breeding females here. And the neat thing about this is you can see the purple and green are, there's some overlap, but they're pretty separated. The green goes this way, the purple goes that way, and there's a nice boundary between their territories right there. And that just shows here a little better at a larger scale. But so they're clearly defending space. We had both these birds nesting. They both failed to predators. They were nesting in very high and exposed locations. But again, exploiting a huge area, even as breeders, going all the way into Idaho and into West Yellowstone, and then even up above here. And they were exploiting people. Here they are working a group that had just come out of the warming hut with lunch. The snowmobile troops come in there as groups of about 25 snowmobiles in tow all day, in and out, in and out. And it's more regulated now with tour leaders. So there aren't snowmobiles going all sorts of different ways, but they do come to consistent places like this parking ground, and the ravens are right there to scavenge from them. They do not get into the backpacks and things like that on snowmobiles very much anymore, because we've co-evolved now with the birds, and every snowmobile in the park, if it's part of one of these tours, has these locking hard cases on the back. No more soft shells that the ravens could get right into and take the food out of. So we've evolved a new way to keep them out, but the ravens are getting back at us. Here's a spot that they've picked a hole in this nice brand new seat of on the snowmobile, and just ripping it up, trying to take their frustrations out on whatever they can get a hold of. And the tour operators there said it was a pretty regular occurrence for them to have damage to their machines from these birds. Well, I want to wrap it up with a couple of thoughts about this in a bigger scheme. I hope you've seen some of the interesting things they do. And as I say, we're really just starting to dig into these data and to really quantify the degree to which individual ravens associate with individual wolves, which seems to be pretty low. And the degree to which ravens even use wolves, which again, relative to use of all those human resources I showed you, is pretty low. And it just seems like people are a much more reliable food source for these birds than the wolves are. I mean, wolves make a kill every few days. But nonetheless, over the course of the last 40 years, from the Christmas bird count data here across the Western US, the number of ravens per party hour has exponentially increased. And it's been doing so for quite some time. For at least the last 20 or so years, it's been on this exponential growth phase. And this, of course, has led to a lot of concern, because ravens not only are scavengers and beggars, and they are also predators. And especially a breeding pair in their area will prey upon songbirds that are there and threatened species like snowy plovers on the coast, getting down to where you guys are, greater sage grouse in the eastern part of your state, and then desert tortoises in the Mojave. And these are all species that have been threatened with habitat loss and other things that we've done to reduce their populations. And now ravens are taking their toll. And so there's been concern about that. And the response has been, in my opinion, it's not been a good response. It has not been to try to understand why that population has increased, but it's simply been to try to stop the population from increasing directly. So here are the number of ravens that our government kills, our wildlife services has killed each year from 2008 to 19. That's about 80 or 90,000 ravens that have been killed during this time period. And it shows really no sign of stopping. It's increasing, and it's one of these what's been termed a forever war that the wildlife services have with successful species like coyotes, rats, crows, and ravens in this case. So it really is not an effective strategy. It might lower predation in an area momentarily, but you've seen the size of an area that these birds cover. You're not going to be able to get all the ravens that are using a particular spot by killing them there, because they're coming in from every which way to that spot. I would think it'd be a much better solution to try and understand, especially around like a lecking area for grouse, or overwintering or migratory or breeding areas for the plovers, tortoise territories, to understand what were the human resources right there that were concentrating birds in that place, and bird proof those. Wires could be put over those sewage plants. Sewage treatment plants are incredible magnets for these birds. Open dumps obviously are. Roadkills are an important source of food I didn't talk about, but we saw lots of concentration of use along the highway. And in Montana, you can, if you hit a animal, you can pick it up and take it home, and you file for a permit online after the fact and are able to keep that. And that's taken thousands of potential food sources off of the ground. So things like that in these sensitive areas, having hunters bury their gut piles in these sensitive areas, for example, would do a lot to keep ravens out of those places. And eventually their populations are going to drop, but it would be more effective in the long term than this short term kind of killing that we're doing now. So I would invite you to keep up with the sorts of things we're doing. Our website it's the Avian Conservation Lab at University of Washington. There's a couple of other ways you can keep up with our birds in particular. You can get this app, Animal Tracker, which is done by Matthias's group at Max Planck. It's free. You can put it on your phone, and you can track all kinds of species around you. And you can type in common raven, and it will take you to our study, and you can see which of our tag birds are where on the landscape. Or if you're interested in seeing their behavior, or expanding to crows, we have a new app here that's also free, especially geared to get kids interested in observing crow behavior and learning a bit about it. But there's a lot of information there for anybody really in terms of their behavior and their calls and things that you could use to help kind of guide your observation of these birds. And then, as August mentioned, I have a new book, In Search of Meadowlarks, and others. My wife and I did this one that dealt really with the raven behavior. And then I believe I talked with you guys last time about our suburban work as well. So lots of ways to get involved and keep your interest going in these sorts of endeavors. So with that, I'll stop talking to my computer and hopefully talk with some of you guys about